IVF babies are more likely to have health problems than those conceived naturally. Yes, the answer is true.
That's right. According to the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, IVF tots are 30% more likely to have health problems or some sort of genetic disorder than those conceived conventionally. First, though, IVF, we're asking if it's been a blessing or a curse. And more than 10,000 test tube tots are born every year. And that's real hope for the 1 in 7 couples who have trouble conceiving these days. Before Louise Brown was born in 1978, women who couldn't get pregnant either had to face up to a childless life or adopt. But now with IVF available on the NHS and also at many private clinics, I get the sense there's a growing belief that anyone can now have a baby, even women well past natural childbearing age. There's a trend for women to put off starting a family later and later in life, and some of my friends, truth be told, are now coming to terms with the fact that they've missed the boat. They thought IVF would hold the answer with some kind of safety net, but it didn't. The success rate for an IVF cycle is only around 25%, but it drops significantly once you're past 35. And couples put themselves and their relationships under enormous pressure, both financially and emotionally, in the quest for an IVF baby. And then there's the cost to the NHS as well, anything between 20 million and 200 million pounds, depending on what you're reading. When we've discussed IVF before, it seemed test tube babies, the science has certainly given some of you the notion that a baby is a human right. But there are no guarantees. Robert, one of the IVF pioneers, and you worked on the Louise Brown situation. I mean, would you accept... I mean, your book deals with the fact that there are negatives for positive advancements. Do you think that IVF may have created problems such as this sort of safety net that women... my age in particular.
You used the word blessing or curse, I think, didn't you? That was the phrase you used. And, of course, it is a blessing because there are 1 million babies born that wouldn't have existed otherwise in the world. But it's rather...
Although you could argue that the planet's overpopulated and that more children isn't good.
That doesn't persuade me much because a million children in terms of 6 billion is, you know, almost entirely irrelevant. But, again, it's the argument about there being a downside to every technology. Actually, one of the most important downsides for me is the huge... cost of IVF, and I do believe there's a massive amount of overcharging and a huge amount of exploitation of women that I think is of serious consideration. So it leads to a lot of technologies, like the male infertility treatment, being overused in many clinics because it's very convenient for them to do that. And I think that's very risky. The HFEA, of course, is now saying that there is this higher risk for IVF babies. That's been known for quite a long time. They tend to be smaller birth weight, and if you're born with a small birth weight, you're more likely to have illness later on in life at the age of 50 or 60. So, for example, heart disease is more common if you're of low birth weight when you're born. And there are all sorts of unforeseen consequences like that which are beginning to be teased out. Of course, IVF is a wonderful treatment. It's given amazing freedom to all sorts of people. But I do think it's used too often. What
do you mean by used too often?
Well, I think that there are many other fertility treatments which are not being used enough, particularly, for example, treatments to unblock fallopian tubes, which are more successful than IVF, but are less used because they require, if you like, quite a lot of skill to deliver them, and also they're time-consuming, so doctors don't want to do that. Well, IVF is very formulaic. It's very easy to deliver. And, of course, it's also quite profitable. Most IVF is done in private clinics. And, unfortunately, how the charges are made is very unclear. It's unclear to me, who's been in the trade, as it were, for a long time.
And older women in their 60s having babies?
Well, that's a rarity. I mean, the press use that a lot to point the finger at IVF, but the number of babies... The number of women that want IVF over the age of 50 is tiny, really. Very, very few. And, you know, I don't approve of somebody at the age of 60 having a child, but it's not really going to shape the moral fabric of Great Britain.
And the idea of this safety net, that women perhaps may delay putting off a child because they think, well, if I do run into problems, there's IVF there's this safety net that I could fall back on.
Well, that's worrying. I think that's very much worrying. And I think what the most worrying aspect, of course, is that because we have IVF and because it's commercial, there is a disincentive for young doctors, young scientists, to do the kind of research that was going on 15 or 20 years ago. So, in fact, we're not progressing. The treatments are not getting much better.
Everyone's relying on IVF.
And in my view, we should be looking at ways we could actually extend childbearing life naturally. And I think, you know, I think if we set our minds to doing that, with women being much more healthy at the age of 40 than they ever were before, that would seem to me to be something that we should be doing, but we're not doing it because nobody wants to bother to do the research, and it's really rather sad. I think that's one of the biggest issues.
I think it's fascinating you have such an open mind to it. I have to say, I didn't know what your take would be. What about you, Mel? Can you... You know, when Louise Brown was born, it was, you know, that was amazing, amazing news.
Yeah. How old is she now? 20?
Yeah, I wasn't involved with Louise
32.
Brown, by the way. No, I mean, I was actually quite sceptical initially, and I didn't...
Were you?
I changed my mind subsequently. I suddenly realised we had to be doing it, and, you know, it was very important for us to do it well, too. So then we started doing a lot of research and so on. But how old is Louise Brown now? Well, this was 1978.
32.
So she's now 32.
Do you think
quite a few of my children have had there are now grandchildren, of course. You know.
Yes.
So I mean, I've got quite a few of my patients have had their own children naturally afterwards.
Right.
So
do you see
nice.
it as an entirely positive phenomenon?
Look, I think that it's such a huge issue. I think there are arguments for and arguments against. I mean, the only experience I have of it is from two friends who've been through IVF. They longed for children, and they got children through IVF, and it's been a happy ending, fantastic. So my experience of it is probably pretty positive through them. But, I mean, I don't think it's something you go into lightly.
Do you think it's having this effect that it may persuade women that there's some kind of safety net, a fallback position that didn't exist pre-1978?
Possibly, but I think I think people think, oh, IVF, it just happens very easily. I don't think it necessarily does it?
I mean, this older women thing has certainly resulted in a lot of younger women considering freezing their eggs and doing other things like this, which I think it's very ill-advised, because the chances of that treatment actually working are not high. It's very expensive, and there may be risks in the long term to those embryos that are born as a consequence of that kind of treatment. So I'm not much in favour of using more and more technology for what should be a natural process.
So I think it's fascinating. I really do. Sanjeev, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, like you, Mel, you know, I know people that have gone through IVF, for whom it's worked and some for whom it hasn't. And I think one of the things that it's easy to bypass is that what it does to the woman's body going through IVF is not particularly pleasant. You know, it's not just turning up and having a little injection. It's a very serious commitment if you're going to go through with it, and you have to look at diet, you have to look at your lifestyle and everything else. I think there's a danger with science generally, that science will somehow provide the answers, because most people look at headlines and they look at the kind of sensational side of it. And if a woman, you know, the one woman over 60 who has kind of, you know, quads through IVF, then becomes the banner for everyone else to kind of go, well, science fixed that, and so
if
whatever problems I'm having right now...
at 60, they must be able to help me at 40.
I'm only 35, and so, you know, of course I've got another kind of 7 years or more to deal with it. I think that's always the danger with science, is that, you know, we as layabouts, you know, we don't necessarily kind of understand the criteria behind it, and we get it through the newspapers, and depending on which newspaper you read and how much depth has gone into it, that will be your view of science.
I think it's fascinating what Robert was saying about the fact that other avenues are no longer being explored or aren't being explored fully. I think that worries me.
Well, you know, the technology is rife with stories about women who failed IVF repeatedly. I was in a taxi yesterday where the driver said to me, well, I came to you at Hammersmith, and he said, we were very appreciative of what you did, but the IVF didn't work. And eventually, he said, we went to another clinic, and that didn't work there either. And then my wife got pregnant naturally. And, I mean, that makes you feel rather humble,
fairly often.
Yes.
It makes you rather humble, you know, when that happens. And that happens quite often.
Actually, what happens there? People go through several stages of IVF and then conceive naturally.
I said in a lecture yesterday, which made the audience roar with laughter, that one of the things I noted when I was at Hammersmith was that, you know, we talked, people would come to the IVF clinic and they'd been infertile for years, and when they left my clinic, before they'd had any treatment, they were pregnant.
The moustache. The moustache. The moustache. The power of the tash.
Robert and his magical tash.
This was in Brighton last night.
Say no more.
But the point I was trying to make was, of course, that, you know, that actually having somebody perhaps who's just a team of people who are sympathetic and who are sort of trying to get you to rethink about how you're handling the situation might be quite important. I don't know.
So you're saying there's a holistic aspect then to a physiological change?
The power of the mind is extraordinary.
Lots of people I've heard of who've had IVF and they've had twins or trips or whatever, then after that go on to have children completely naturally, don't they?
Okay.
Yes, I do.
So the body's almost used to it, so can do it for itself.
Well, I mean, you know, it's like all science. You know, the more we do, the less, in some ways, we understand, and that's why it's such a fantastic thing to be in.
Want to jump in and take your views on this? Blessing or curse, black or white, as per usual. Let's see what you think.
First, we have Jane on line 1.